Montana Territory, spring of 1885. Red Bluff sat at the ragged edge of the trail right where pine roots began to split the earth. Dust hung in the air like it didn't know where else to settle. Smoke from cook fires drifted low. The smell of horse sweat and old tobacco clung to everything. At the edge of town, someone had hammered together a rough platform, planks nailed onto wagon crates. A small crowd gathered. Men with worn boots and hollowed hearts. They'd come to trade tools, livestock. And at the bitter end, something human. She stood barefoot on the platform, her ankles dusted from the trail. Rough cloth swaddled her head and mouth, torn from some forgotten sack. It clung to her like shame, sun-bleached and wind-frayed. Only her eyes showed, steady, distant, giving nothing back. Lightless pools of hazel. Her wrists were bound tight, trembling just enough to be noticed. She hadn't spoken since Idaho, not a word, not a name. The man running the auction wore a weathered burgundy vest and a rusted badge barely hanging from his chest. He slammed a gavel against the crate. "Last one for the day," he called. "Ain't got no name. Ain't shown her face. Says she'll work. Says she'll obey. Starting bid $1. He looked over the crowd. Who's fool enough or full enough of whiskey to take on a riddle in a corset? A ripple of laughter followed. "Bet she's a cactus in disguise. Prickly and full of secrets," someone shouted. "Or maybe just a sack of laundry with opinions," another said. "Go on, marry the bedsheet. She's got about as much to say," a third joked. Some men turned away. Others just elbowed each other, waiting for someone bold or drunk enough to raise a hand. She didn't flinch. Her hands hung loose, wrists raw. The cloth sack moved only with her breathing, shallow, steady. Her fingers flexed and released in small measured rhythms, controlled but not calm. The auctioneer frowned. She's no good to anyone if she won't even speak. Still no one moved. Then the crowd shifted. A man stepped forward, tall, his coat dusty at the cuffs. Boots caked with dry mud. The brim of his trail hat shaded most of his face. One hand was wrapped in leather strips, the kind earned by rope and heat, not accident. He didn't say a word until he reached the front. $1. The air went quiet. "You sure?" The auctioneer asked. "Don't even want to see what you're buying." The man looked at her. She hadn't flinched. "I ain't buying a face," he said. "I'm marrying a person." Even the wind went still. The auctioneer blinked. "Name?" "Luke Thatcher. Cowboy, lives east of Red Bluff." The auctioneer scribbled on a ledger, slid a page forward. Luke signed without a word. Then the man turned toward the figure in the sack. "You're now legally wed, miss. Say your name for the record." The crowd shifted. A few leaned in. At first, nothing. Then behind the cloth, a voice. Dry, faint, but clear enough to carry. "Willa Mercer." Luke's hand stilled. Just a flicker. Then his jaw set and he looked at her. He didn't ask a thing. Just stepped up to the platform, reached gently for her arm, and untied the ropes digging into her wrists. Then he led her down. No one jeered. No one laughed. Not a word, only the sound of boots on dry wood. And a name that stayed in the air like a secret finding its way home. Willa Mercer. The trail out of Red Bluff narrowed fast, dust giving way to pine needles and packed earth. Sunlight barely made it through the canopy, and when it did, it came soft and slanted, like it wasn't sure it was welcome. Luke Thatcher walked ahead, boots steady. A mule followed, loaded with supplies. He never looked back. Behind him, Willa Mercer walked in silence. The sack still covered her head. Her steps were careful, not weak. Her hands, now unbound, stayed clasped in front of her like she wasn't quite sure what to do with freedom yet. They walked for over an hour. No words passed between them, just the quiet breath of the trees, and the sound of old leather shifting with every step. The woods opened into a quiet clearing, carved into the hillside like someone had chosen the spot on purpose. And there stood the cabin. It was built from dark-cut timber and small, squared and sturdy, like it had stood there for years and planned to stay for more. A stack of firewood leaned against the side wall. Above the door, a rusted horseshoe hung, bent and split at one end. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney. Luke stepped up and pushed the door open. Inside was a single room, tight, clean, a cot, a table, one chair, a stove, a basin. The hearth was cold but ready. He stepped back and spoke softly. "Ain't no one telling you where to be now. That's yours to decide." Willa stepped in slow. She didn't speak, didn't touch a thing. She crossed to the far wall, crouched low and sat with her back to the room. Hands on her knees, still facing away, Luke said nothing. He hung his hat on a wooden hook and moved to the stove. Set kindling, struck a spark, coaxed a flame, filled a pot, dropped in a few scraps, dried root, a bit of meat, some bitter leaf. The scent rose slow and warm. Smoke, salt, spice. The kind of meal made for long silences. He didn't glance her way. Just ladled 2 bowls. One he placed near her without a word. The other he set at the table. Then he sat and waited. Minutes passed. Then her voice came. Muffled but steady. What is this? Luke stirred his stew. Meal for the last one standing. There was a pause. The sound of her shifting. I used to make it for myself, he said. After the war. After long days with no one talking. He paused again. Then I started making 2 bowls, even when there wasn't anyone there. She turned her head, just slightly. On the chair beside Luke sat a second bowl. Steam still curling from it, but no one else in the room. I used to set it for my wife, he said quietly. She passed from fever one spring, quick, quiet, brave to the end. He looked toward the fire. I kept setting it out. Just to remind myself I made it home again. Now I set it for her. Hand for you. Willa said nothing. Then she reached for the bowl. Her hand trembled as she brought the spoon beneath the sack. She didn't remove it. Ate slowly. Movement small, careful, but she finished every bite. Later, while Luke washed the bowls in a tin basin, she stayed by the wall. Arms around her knees. Still watching. Still quiet. But this time she wasn't hiding from the room. And somewhere in the quiet, something shifted. The fire cracked low in the hearth, throwing soft shadows across the cabin walls. Luke sat with elbows on his knees, staring into the coals. No lantern lit. The fire was enough. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, and like breath in a sleeping chest. Long, slow, old. He didn't look her way. He didn't have to. She still sat by the far wall, knees drawn to her chest, the sack still over her head, but she hadn't touched the door. Hadn't tried to leave. Luke worked his jaw quietly, rubbed his palms once, then leaned closer to the fire. It was 4 winters back, he said, thicker than any before. Bark stripping cold, bit through wool. I'd ridden too far north, chasing timber I couldn't afford to lose. Pride got ahead of sense, he shook his head. Didn't turn back when I should have. Snow packed hard beneath me. My leg twisted sharp, felt the break clean. He stared at the flames. I crawled into a drift. Thought this is how men vanish. Then his voice dropped low. But hands found me, fast, rough, alive, dragged me into the dark. He paused. When I woke, there was fire. And a cave. He remembered the flicker of flame. Ice at the entrance. Heat on his face. The sharp scent of something bitter and boiled. Across from him sat a woman. Her face hidden beneath coarse sackcloth, knotted at the neck. Only her eyes visible. Still shadowed. Her coat was worn leather and threadbare wool. Her hands worked fast, pouring dark liquid into a tin cup. You don't need to know who I am, she'd said. But I'm not going to let you die. He couldn't speak. Could barely breathe. She pressed the tin to his hands. It's pine bark. Dry lichen drink, he drank. It burned going down, but it kept his breath steady. She wrapped his leg. Braced it with hot stones. Fed the fire. She moved like someone used to being invisible, quiet, constant. He remembered fading in and out, fever, pain, cold pulling at him. Then one morning she was gone. The cave was quiet, but safe, and the fire still burned. Folded with strange care was a square of cloth, no bigger than a hand, stitched with purple flowers in uneven thread. Luke had kept it. It lived in the lining of his coat, tucked deep where even the worst days couldn't wear it out. And now, 3 years later, he knew. The voice that spoke her name on the auction platform, Willa Mercer, was the same voice that whispered over that tin cup in the snow, same rhythm, same weight, same stillness. He didn't need proof. Not after all this time. His hand reached into his coat pocket. Fingers closed around the cloth. He didn't pull it out, just held it there. Behind him she shifted slightly. The sack rustled. She still hadn't spoken. He didn't turn. But in the quiet space between the hearth and the wall, between all the years behind and the room around them, Luke Thatcher made a quiet decision. He wouldn't ask her to confirm what she wasn't ready to share. He wouldn't make her relive what she hadn't offered, but one thing was certain. He wouldn't let her vanish again. Mist hugged the roots of the trees, curling silver and low across the ground. Up above, a few crows traced quiet paths through the morning sky. The sun filtered in late, slow and unsure between the pines. Willa Mercer stepped out alone. She crossed the porch, past the empty wash basin, past the mule dozing near the post, and made her way to the tall pine that stood at the edge of the clearing, like a quiet sentinel. The sack still covered her head, tied loose now, not choking. Its hem fluttered faintly in the breeze. Her steps were slower, steadier, her spine no longer bent inward. At the base of the tree, she sat. She turned her face toward a break in the woods where a soft line of light touched the clearing's edge. Then, with both hands, she reached behind her neck. The knot came loose. The sack slid upward, revealing her nose, her mouth, the curve of her cheek. She let the morning air touch her skin. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't surrender. It was something in between. By the side of the cabin, Luke Thatcher knelt beside a wooden basin, oiling the teeth of his saw. He didn't flinch when she came into view. Didn't look up right away. Then, without lifting his eyes, he said, "Got turned around once. Deep winter. Near Black Ram." His hand moved slowly along the blade, broke my leg. Thought that was it. Figured I'd die out there. Willa stayed quiet, eyes fixed on the moss at her feet. "But someone found me," Luke said, "dragged me into a cave, built a fire, fed me bitter tea that tasted like bark, kept me alive." He set the saw down gently and looked her way, not quite at her, but near. She wore a sack over her head. Never told me her name. Hardly spoke at all. A breath passed between them, but I remember her voice. There was a stillness then, not guilt, not fear, just stillness. Then the sound of fabric. Willa pulled the sack the rest of the way off and let it fall into her lap. Her face wasn't monstrous, wasn't ruined, but along her left cheek ran a scar, deep, curved and permanent, from temple to jaw, like someone had tried to carve the truth out of her. And failed. She looked up. "The man who ran the boarding house where I worked," she said, voice steady, "told me I could keep my room. If I gave more." She paused. I said no. Her hands tightened on the folded sack. Her knuckles pale. He came at me. I fought back. He slipped. Hit the stove. Didn't get up. Luke didn't move. They said I lured him. Said I planned it. Said I killed him on purpose. She swallowed. But I think someone saw. I remember. A shadow near the door. A woman in the kitchen. She turned away from him now, eyes out toward the woods. No one spoke up. No one stood by me. She looked down again, back at her hands. They called me a liar. A temptress? Her killer. Luke rose slowly. Quiet. They sold me off to pay his debts, she continued. Passed me from one hand to another like cattle. Her voice dropped low. Covered my face so no one would see the scar. So they wouldn't decide what I was worth. Before I even opened my mouth. Her voice trembled, but she didn't fall apart. I didn't ask to be saved, she said. And I didn't ask to be bought. She looked up at him fully now. Eyes steady. Face clear. But I'm tired of hiding. Luke didn't step forward. Didn't reach for her hand. Didn't try to take the sack. He just stood there, hands resting loose at his sides. "Thank you for telling me," he said. His voice was soft but sure. "You didn't have to." "But you did." She blinked once, hard, but no tears came. Only breath, and in that breath, something let go. For the first time since she'd stepped onto that auction stage, she was no longer a shadow. She was Willa Mercer. And she wasn't hiding anymore. Light moved softly across the cabin floorboards, golden through the window above the table. Dust floated in the air like quiet movement stirred by nothing. It was the kind of morning where stillness didn't feel empty. It felt earned. Willa Mercer rose slowly from the cot. Her hair had come loose during the night, curling gently at her shoulders. She didn't reach for the sack. It wasn't near the bed. It hadn't been folded. It hadn't been needed. She crossed the room on bare feet, expecting the usual, a bowl, a cup, a wash rag by the basin. Instead, something new was waiting. On the table sat a small mirror, oval, silver-edged, worn at the corners but carefully cleaned. It was propped against a smooth wedge of pine, angled just right so that morning light touched it gently. Beside it lay a scarf, faded, dust-colored silk, folded with quiet precision. No note. No gesture. Just the mirror. And the scarf waiting. Willa stopped. She didn't reach for them. Not yet. The fire in the stove had burned low. The room was quiet but not cold. Outside, birds began calling from the trees. Somewhere, water dripped from a pine branch. A breeze passed through the half-open window. She stepped closer. She had never needed glass to know her face. The scar wasn't a mystery. It was a path her fingers had traced in the dark. A line she had measured in silence. She sat and looked, not with dread, not with defiance, but with the stillness that only comes after survival. Her hand lifted slowly. She traced the line of the scar, not as something to hide, but something endured, the way a soldier might touch the edge of a medal they never asked for. Then her eyes turned to the scarf. She picked it up. It slipped through her fingers like morning air, soft, cool, worn in places, but never forgotten. There was weight in the fabric. Not from age, from memory. She brought it to her head, not to cover, not to disappear, but to shape what others would see, to soften the harshness, to say, "This is mine now." She tied it with calm fingers. No trembling. The woman in the mirror was no longer a question, no longer what had been done to her. She was becoming what she chose to be. Behind her, the door creaked open. Willa didn't turn. Luke Thatcher stood in the doorway, one shoulder against the frame, hat in hand. He spoke quietly. "That used to be my wife's," he said. "She wore it whenever she needed to feel like herself again." Willa's fingers brushed the edge of the scarf near her temple. "I thought," Luke continued, "maybe it would suit you too." She turned toward him, gently. Not guarded. He met her gaze. "Anyone who tries to make you ashamed of what you lived through," he said, "is blind." A breath passed. "And the blind," he added, "don't get to judge beauty." Her throat tightened. One hand rested lightly on the table beside the mirror. She didn't cry, but she breathed, fully. Then she reached forward and placed her palm against the mirror, not to test what she saw, but to meet it. And in that quiet morning light, wearing borrowed silk and her own name, Willa Mercer let herself be seen. The days turned green and slow. Spring soaked deeper into the soil. Water moved louder in the stream. Birds returned to the trees. Willa kept to her rhythm, and quiet and steady, fetching water, hanging linens, stitching a new dress, one thread at a time. She didn't wear the scarf every day, but she didn't fold it away either. It stayed draped on the back of the chair, like something alive, something present. Luke Thatcher worked in the clearing, building a structure near the edge of the grass where the trees began. 4 upright beams, a crossbar, an arch. No one said what it was. They didn't need to, but peace has a short reach in places like this, and it never holds long without being tested. One morning, just past dawn, a horse came up the trail into Red Bluff. The rider wore a long duster, torn at the shoulders, dust-colored from hard days on the trail. His face was narrow, half-shadowed by the brim of his hat. His eyes, gray and flat, moved like blades. He didn't ask questions. He introduced himself in a saloon. He came into town looking like a traveler, said he was after work with the timberman, but he wasn't a drifter. He was a hunter. His name was Ford. He asked about a scarred woman, said she might have passed through recently, mentioned whispers of a man hiding her up in the trees, said she could be dangerous, said there was blood in her past. He smiled when he said it, but there was no kindness in it. Rumor had already made its way up the trail ahead of him. By the time Ford reached the supply shed outside Red Bluff, Luke was unloading sacks of grain. Ford tipped his hat. "You Thatcher?" Luke didn't answer right away. He looked past the man toward the woods, toward the kind of silence that always said more than words. "You live alone up there?" Ford asked. Luke didn't reply. But the way his jaw moved was answer enough. That evening, Luke returned to the cabin. His face was calm but colder than usual. "He's hunting you," he said. Willa didn't ask who. She stood by the stove, ladling stew into a tin bowl. Then, without a word, she crossed the room, opened the cedar chest, and pulled out the sack. It had been neatly folded. Untouched for weeks, she held it in both hands for a long moment. "I'll wear it again," she said. "One more time." Luke stepped forward. "You don't have to." Her eyes met his. "I choose it," she said. "Not to hide. To move unseen." They laid the plan by firelight. Quiet voices, steady hands. Willa would ride east before sunrise down the narrow logging trail. The sack tied tight. The story written in shadows. Ford would follow, and he couldn't help himself. A lone woman, scarred and hidden. It would be too tempting. Luke would ride west over the ridge to the sheriff's station. If they timed it right, they'd meet on the far side of the bluffs, waiting for Ford to ride straight into the trap. Before first light, Willa mounted Luke's bay gelding, the one tethered behind the shed. The sack was tied firm. Her heart beat fast in her ribs, but her hands were steady. She didn't tremble. She didn't turn. She rode by late afternoon. Ford had taken the bait. He followed her deep into the eastern rocks, where the trail narrowed into a corridor carved by water and time. At the end of that passage, waiting with rifles drawn, stood Luke, the sheriff of Red Bluff, and 2 ridge deputies behind the stones. Ford drew first. But not fast enough. They brought him down hard, disarmed him, bound his hands behind his back, slung him over his own horse like a sack of grain. He was charged with unlawful pursuit, intent to harm, and reckless threat of violence. He said nothing. High on the hill above, Willa watched it unfold. Still wrapped in the sack, still silent. Only when Ford was gone did she ride down. Luke was already stepping toward her, arms ready to help her dismount. She accepted the gesture, not because she needed it, but because she trusted it. Then slowly she reached behind her neck, untied the knot, pulled the sack away. She folded it once, then twice, and held it in both hands. "It saved me," she said. "One last time. Not because it hid me, but because I used it." Luke nodded. "What will you do with it now?" She looked around, to the trail, to the arch rising behind the cabin, to a world she no longer had to outrun. "I'll keep it," she said. "Not as a burden, but as a testament." Luke's brow lifted slightly. "A testament to what?" Her smile was calm, almost reverent. "That what once bound me has no power now, that the yoke was broken. And I walked free, us by my own choosing." The days that followed were quieter. Ford was gone. The trap had held, but justice on paper was still unfinished. Back at the cabin, Willa hung the laundry with bare hands. No gloves, no veil. Her dress fluttered in the wind, and simple, well-mended hers. Inside, Luke worked at the table with a chisel, carving the final detail into the arch outside. The linen that would hang from it lay folded nearby, its corners weighted with river stones. He didn't rush. Every line had its place. Willa passed behind him, carrying a tin of clothespins. Neither said much. They didn't need to. Late that morning, a rider appeared at the edge of the woods. It was the sheriff. Dust clung to his coat. His horse was lathered with sweat, and in his hand, held loose but certain, was a sealed envelope. Luke met him near the gate. No questions, no ceremony. The sheriff handed over the letter, tipped his hat, and turned to ride back the way he came. Luke stood still for a moment, the envelope heavy in his hand. Then he walked it inside. What Willa didn't know yet was that Anna Turner had written a letter of her own. 3 pages. Plain-spoken truth, signed with a steady hand. She'd once looked away in a kitchen doorway, but this time she didn't look away. She swore to what she'd seen, signed her name, and mailed the letter to the courthouse in Helena herself. Sometimes justice doesn't move until a woman shoves it forward. Anna Turner shoved. Inside the cabin, Willa stood at the mirror. The scarf lay draped on the chair behind her. Her hair was loose, her hands still. She didn't reach for the sack. There was no need. Luke entered quietly. He held out an envelope. Said nothing. She took it. Her fingers trembled just once as she slid her thumb beneath the seal. She unfolded the paper. Read it first to herself. Then aloud. Charges against Willa Mercer dropped. Case closed. Warrant rescinded. She stared at the letter a long moment, then folded it slow, careful, and stepped outside. She walked past the woodpile, past the split-log bench, out to the clearing at the edge of the trees, where 4 upright beams stood beneath an open sky. Luke was there, hammering the last nail into the base of the arch. The linen cloth had already been hung. It moved in the breeze, soft and weightless, catching threads of sunlight between the shadows. Willa stepped beside it. The letter still in her hand. She didn't cry, didn't smile right away either. She just breathed, and for the first time since she was sold into silence, her breath came without weight. Behind her, Luke straightened, brushed sawdust from his hands. Without turning, she said, "I want to use the sack." Luke's brow furrowed gently. "You sure?" She nodded. Not the way it was. Not to hide, she turned to face him. I want to make something from it. Something I choose. Spring had arrived in full now. The trees wore green without apology. Wildflowers pushed through stone. The wind no longer whispered warnings. It carried warmth. The cabin sat quietly beneath the pines. And at the edge of the clearing, the arch stood tall. The linen swaying softly in the morning light. They hadn't sent word across town. Hadn't called a crowd, but the people who mattered came anyway. Anna Turner climbed the ridge path in a cotton dress that matched nothing but her spirit. She carried a small bouquet of yellow bells. The old blacksmith brought a jug of applejack. The town baker brought bread wrapped in worn calico. They were few, but they were enough. Inside the cabin, Willa Mercer stood before the mirror. Her dress was cream muslin, hand-stitched. Not fancy, but flawless in its honesty. She'd sewn it over 3 nights. Needle steady, breath slow. On her head she wore a veil. It had once been a sack. She and Luke had washed it together, soaked it in sun, trimmed the edges with white thread, the kind meant to hold old fabric together without showing the seams. In each corner she'd embroidered faint purple wildflowers, the same shape as the ones on the scrap of cloth she'd left behind in the snow years ago. It didn't look like something meant to erase a person anymore. It looked like something claimed. When she stepped outside, the forest paused. Luke stood beneath the arch. Hair combed back, boots scrubbed clean. He wore his only shirt without sap stains. It hung stiff across his shoulders, but the way he stood in it made it fit. He saw her. And in that moment, everything else, the wind, the trees, the sky, fell quiet. She walked toward him without hesitation. Not like someone being given away, but like someone who had chosen this moment with her whole self. When she reached him, he took her hands in his. No matter what covered your face, he said, you were always the woman I chose. He looked into her eyes. And now? You're the woman I vowed to stand beside. To the end. Willa smiled. Not the hesitant smile of someone testing hope, but the quiet peace of someone who had finally stopped running. I vow the same, she said. There was no priest. No scripture, just them. The trees, and the people who stayed when others didn't. They kissed, soft, certain. And the linen above them caught the wind like a sail lifting toward something new. A few drops of rain fell, light as breath. No one moved for shelter. Anna leaned toward the blacksmith and the baker and said, Never thought I'd see a burlap sack turned into a wedding veil. The blacksmith grinned. Ain't the sack, he said. It's what she turned it into. That night, as the fire cracked low and laughter faded into birdsong, Willa sat beside Luke on the porch. The veil lay folded in her lap. Her fingers traced the embroidered edges. This used to mean everything I feared, she said. Luke looked at her. And now, she smiled, now, it means everything I chose. He reached for her hand. Their fingers wove together. They sat like that until the stars came out, and the woods, once a place of silence and shadows, held them gently. Like a home earned, not given, and so beneath the tall pines, with a veil once born of shame, now worn like a crown of her own making, Willa Mercer and Luke Thatcher found what so many on the frontier never did. Not peace through forgetting, but peace through reclaiming. Their love didn't erase the past. It didn't heal every scar, but it turned what once hurt them into something that could bless them, because in the hard country, where stories often break before they end, survival isn't just holding on. It's choosing what's worth holding on to.